My name is Lisa, a 35-year-old part-time worker, living with my husband Mark and our daughter Emma. Mark works in an office and Emma is in first grade. We purchased an old single-family home and are still paying off the mortgage together. When Emma started elementary school, I began working part-time. Mark is the eldest son, but his younger sister Nancy married before us and settled somewhat comfortably in their parents' house, living with their father. My father-in-law seemed open to anyone taking over the house, except Nancy, who claimed it as hers, stating, "I'll take care of Dad, so I'll take the house." When Nancy got married and moved into her parents' house, her mother had already passed away, leaving her father in good health, so she didn't have to care for him. The house was large, and I remember being surprised when I first visited it before getting married. It had a splendid gate and an expansive plot of land, which made me ask Mark, "Could it be that your parents are wealthy?" During our dating days, Mark never gave the impression of being wealthy, but the grandeur of his parents' house was quite a shock. Mark denied it, but the interior of the house was equally impressive, surprising me even more. According to Mark, his grandfather had been wealthy. The family faced financial difficulties during his father's generation. He chuckled, explaining that while the house left by his grandfather was large, it was old and uncomfortable to live in. Mark assured me when we got married that since Nancy would take care of their father, I would never have to worry about it. Our plan was to let Nancy inherit the house for taking care of him, so we bought our current house. Even from my father-in-law's perspective, he seemed more comfortable being looked after by his daughter than his daughter-in-law should he become bedridden and need care in the future. However, during visits for Christmas or summer holidays, Nancy often mistreated her father. She treated him as an outcast during meals, and if Mark or I tried to join them, she would angrily assert, "Dad likes to eat alone. Don't you fear." After meals, when I went to my father-in-law's room to talk, he expressed his dissatisfaction with Nancy. "I don't want to live in this house because Nancy gets in the way," he confided. According to him, he always eats separately from Nancy's family and receives fewer side dishes, despite Nancy receiving a decent amount of money for living expenses from his pension. Nancy had promised to take care of her father but doesn't do his laundry or much housework in general. My father-in-law ends up doing most of the cleaning inside the house and takes care of all the gardening himself. Even Nancy's husband and children, who live with them, don't treat my father-in-law with respect. When he once asked Nancy's husband for a ride to the horse race track on his day off, since my father-in-law doesn't drive, he was dismissed rudely. "I'm not your chauffeur. If you want to go to the races, use a taxi. If you have money to waste on horse racing, contribute it to living expenses," Nancy's husband retorted dismissively. My father-in-law tried to brush it off as a light-hearted comment, but he was strongly reprimanded. Nancy's 10-year-old son also behaves disrespectfully, teasing my father-in-law with cheeky remarks like, "Grandpa, stay away, you smell. Don't leave your room," despite it having lived together since birth. It seems my father-in-law has no memory of ever holding him. In contrast, when my daughter visits, he dotes on her, hinting at his loneliness. Hearing such melancholic words, I started feeling sorry for my father-in-law. Every time we visit their house, my husband gets upset, urging Nancy to treat their father better. In response, my sister-in-law angrily retorts at my husband, "I am treating Dad just fine. Are you trying to steal this house from me? I won't let this house go to anyone," my sister-in-law declared defiantly. My husband remarked to me later, "It's scary how obsessed my sister-in-law is with the house." Then, my father-in-law had a fall at home. The house, not equipped for the elderly, caused him to trip over a small step, fracturing his right hand in the process. Thankfully, he sustained no other injuries and didn't require hospitalization. However, the fracture severely limited his ability to use his dominant hand, making everyday tasks challenging. When we visited him, we were shocked to see how frail he had become. Not only could he not use his right hand, but moving around was also difficult. It was evident he needed care. However, my sister-in-law's family completely ignored him and didn't take care of him. While he could manage to get to the bathroom on his own, eating was a struggle. My husband confronted my sister-in-law immediately. "Why don't you look after Dad?" he demanded. But my sister-in-law seemed indifferent. "A broken hand is no big deal. Stop making a fuss. He can walk by himself, and he isn't complaining." She shrugged off the concerns. My father-in-law, accustomed to being neglected, seemed unable to stand up for himself against my sister-in-law. She knew it and took advantage of it. My husband was furious. Isn't it obvious? We should take care of our parents, he argued passionately. Mockingly, my sister-in-law smirked at my husband and said, "The same goes for you, right, Mark? You look after Dad. I don't need an old man with barely any money," she sneered callously. I was enraged by how callous my sister-in-law could be towards her own father. Unable to contain myself, I spoke up. "Fine. We will take care of him. If he stays here, he won't heal properly." My husband seemed to agree. We decided to take my father-in-law and move him out of his house immediately. As we packed up his belongings, my sister-in-law started making demands. "Just because you're taking care of Dad doesn't mean you get the house." It became clear that my sister-in-law cared more about the house than her father. My husband responded dismissively, "Don't worry, I already bought a house. I don't need this one. Do whatever you want with it," my husband declared. My sister-in-law seemed relieved to hear his words. As we prepared for my father-in-law's move, neither she nor her husband offered any help. Instead, they keenly searched through his belongings, hoping to find valuable items they could convert into cash. It was clear they had been benefiting from his pension, and with him gone, that would soon end. However, they found no treasures to exploit. When my father-in-law left his house, neither my sister-in-law nor her family bothered to see him off. Their coldness was striking. Upon arriving at our house, my father-in-law seemed to brighten up. He happily played with my daughter, appearing completely different from his time at his own home. We gave him a room that wasn't being used, but since the move was sudden, we hadn't made any preparations. If we had known earlier, we could have renovated, installed handrails, and removed any steps. I apologized to my father-in-law. "Sorry, I wasn't quite prepared. I'll install the handrails and make other adjustments soon." To my surprise, my father-in-law seemed equally apologetic. "My apologies too for making you worry," he said. "I wonder if $200 million will be enough to cover my care and look after my horses." I couldn't help but laugh. Is my father-in-law making jokes like this now? I wondered, noticing his newfound cheerfulness since moving into our home. "Horses, you say?" I chuckled, finding it hard to take seriously such a far-fetched idea of horses and $200 million. Playing along with his jest, I replied, "I'm not sure how much it costs to take care of horses, but taking care of you will definitely cost more." His mention of horses puzzled me, seeming typical of someone wealthy. But when I saw his worried expression at my response, I realized he wasn't joking. "Does taking care of a person really cost that much?" "All I have left is $200 million, he said seriously. In a panic, I reassured him. My earlier comment was just a joke. $200 million is plenty, more than enough, in fact. I immediately sought my husband for clarification on the horse business and the $200 million. He too was puzzled but recalled his grandfather mentioning wealth from land ownership. "Do you remember my granddad being a wealthy man?" he asked me. "Maybe Dad owned horses," he mused. Together, we approached my father-in-law for the full story. It turned out he had owned horses for years, making frequent trips to the racetrack not to bet but to check on his own horses. He had kept this part of his life secret from his family, so my husband and his sister had no idea. With his broken hand, my father-in-law was now seriously considering his future. He feared that revealing his horse ownership and $200 million in assets to his daughter and son-in-law might lead them to demand it. Perhaps my mention of home modifications had sparked this concern, prompting him to confide in me about his situation. Understanding his worries, my husband cheerfully reassured his father, easing his concerns about the future. "I'm not sure how much it costs to take care of horses, but if you've got $200 million, you should be okay. We'll figure out your caregiving expenses, so just leave it to us," my husband reassured my father-in-law confidently. After confirming with the person who had always looked after the horses that there would be no issues, we put the horse issue to rest. Now knowing that my father-in-law was quite wealthy, I began to see him in a slightly different light. I couldn't help but imagine his daughter's regret for kicking him out despite his considerable assets. The thought brought a sense of satisfaction. Since my father-in-law moved in with us, our lives had changed. Balancing my part-time job and caring for him was hectic, but my husband pitched in, and we managed. With him at home, my daughter found a new conversation partner, and he seemed happier. His walking had improved since moving in, and even before we finished the home modifications, he could walk slowly with the help of a cane. Although his broken hand hadn't healed yet, he was practicing eating with his left hand. Back at his previous home, his nephew would complain whenever he left his room, and he hadn't been very active. Whenever he tried to go to the racetrack, his son-in-law would show annoyance. This lack of activity might have led to his muscles weakening, contributing to his fall. On sunny days, he could now go for walks with the help of my daughter. I had been so focused on my father-in-law's recovery that I had completely forgotten about my sister-in-law. However, 3 months after he moved in with us, my sister-in-law called in a panic. "Is Dad there? If he's there, get him on the phone immediately." At that moment, my father-in-law was out for a walk with my husband and daughter. When I informed her of this, she grew even angrier. "You knew, didn't you? You knew that house was rented. That's why you took Dad to cause problems for us." I couldn't grasp what my sister-in-law meant. She seemed to be suggesting that their house was rented, but she had always boasted that it was theirs, even if the property was still in my father-in-law's name. Calling it a rented house didn't add up. As I struggled to respond, my sister-in-law grew increasingly heated. "Some guy claiming to be the landlord of our family home showed up," she continued angrily, saying I'm behind on rent and that I need to either pay up or get out. Confusion swirled in my head. When she mentioned the landlord of their home, I wondered if my father-in-law had gone to collect rent from my sister-in-law. Just then, my father-in-law returned. I quickly explained the situation and handed him the phone to answer my sister-in-law directly. With a hint of anger in his voice, my father-in-law addressed the daughter who had driven him out of his own home. "Weren't you informed that the house was rented? That house belongs to the company where my father was the CEO. I had been paying the rent until you kicked me out," he explained calmly, yet with a hint of detachment. My sister-in-law, sensing his anger, shouted back through the phone, "I haven't heard anything about this. I'm coming over right now, so wait for me," my sister-in-law declared over the phone. About 30 minutes later, she and her husband arrived, their faces flushed red with surprise at seeing my father-in-law walking on his own. However, there were more pressing issues at hand as my sister-in-law erupted once more. "I thought the house and land belonged to you, Dad. Did you deceive me?" she accused. Grinning at her, my father-in-law calmly responded, "I didn't deceive you. I just kept silent because of how harshly you've been treating me." His comment left my sister-in-law speechless, prompting her husband to intervene. "Setting that aside, can you please hand over the rent? If you don't, we'll be kicked out of the house," he pleaded desperately. "Why should I pay rent for a house where I'm not living after you guys kicked me out? Don't you think that's a bit too much to ask?" My father-in-law countered, laughing off the request. Unable to argue with his reasonable statement, my brother-in-law fell silent. It was then my sister-in-law spoke up again. "Dad, were you planning to deceive us from the beginning, pretending to be injured? You seem far more energetic than when you were living with us," she accused. Stepping in to clarify, I interjected, "That's because he's been doing daily rehab exercises, practicing walking and training to eat with his injured hand." Adding to my explanation, my father-in-law nodded sagely. "I think being kicked out by you guys was a blessing. Ever since I came to live with Mark, we all eat together, and I'm never treated like a nuisance." My sister-in-law and her husband fell silent, jaws clenched, upon hearing this. Just then, my daughter innocently chimed in, "Grandpa, your horse is going to race in the next horse race, right?" Grinning warmly, my father-in-law replied, "It'll be in this Sunday's race. Why don't we go watch it together?" Excitedly, my daughter ran off, but my sister-in-law and her husband seemed to grasp the implications. Hastily, they asked my father-in-law, "Dad, do you own a horse? Are you a horse owner?" With a smug look on his face, my father-in-law finally admitted, "I kept silent because I figured if I told you about money, you'd just take it." Talking about horse racing always gets your husband frowning. My father-in-law's previously jovial face turned stern. His intimidating expression sent chills down my spine, and as he slowly began to speak, the tension in the room grew palpable. "I no longer consider someone who disrespects her own father as my daughter. I knew you moved in with me for the inheritance." My father-in-law's stern tone caught my sister-in-law off guard, leaving her visibly stunned. Adding the final blow, he declared, "You won't get a single cent of my inheritance." These words seemed to knock the wind out of my sister-in-law. Her husband, who had been supporting her staunchly, suddenly looked defeated. They both slumped their shoulders and left. The rent for my father-in-law's house was a hefty sum, far beyond what my sister-in-law and her husband could afford. Inevitably, they had to move out. I had no idea that my parents-in-law's house was rented, and neither did my husband. He later confirmed it with his father. After moving out, my sister-in-law, who had been careless with money, suddenly found herself in a financial crisis. Their habit of splurging continued, and they started relying heavily on credit cards, which only led to mounting debt. I heard they moved in with her husband's parents, but I don't know much about what happened after that. On the other hand, things have been smooth for us since we started living with my father-in-law. His broken hand healed well, and his legs and hips grew stronger to the point where he could manage everything on his own. He's now so energetic that he even goes jogging with my daughter. He's like a different person from when we first moved in. Since this incident, my father-in-law has been discussing various things with my husband and has started planning for the future, including drafting a will. I'm not sure what's in the will, but I assume he's arranged things so that his daughter won't inherit anything. What made me happiest was when my father-in-law paid off the remaining balance of our home loan. We still had nearly 20 years of payments left, but I'm grateful that he paid it off ahead of schedule. With the loan fully paid, my father-in-law is now considering renovations to make our home more accessible. He talks about his plans with a smile, but I don't want him to talk about becoming bedridden anytime soon. I want him to stay healthy.